Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sandy Johnston. I'm a transportation planner with the staff to the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. And I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon at the second of our forums hosted digitally this year on travel demand management. We hosted one back in February, and we are finishing out our fiscal year strong with this one today. I'm going to start us off by handing it over to my colleague Travis Pollock from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council to give a little bit of an introduction as to what we are all doing here today.
Thanks, Sandy. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Travis Pollock. I'm a senior transportation planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and the MAPC is the regional planning agency for the 101 cities and towns in Greater Boston. Our mission is to promote smart growth and regional collaboration. We assist municipalities in our region in various disciplines, including transportation, clean energy, environment and climate, land use, economic development, housing, public health, arts and culture, as well as community engagement, communications, collective purchasing, and data research and services. For those of you outside Boston or Massachusetts, MAPC is the regional planning agency, and MAPC is a member of the MPO, and we coordinate with Sandy and others and taken at the MPO. So I'd like to just give a brief definition of what we call transportation demand management, at least at MAPC from our previous work. TDM refers to a package of policies and programs that are designed to reduce drive-alone trips and enable the transportation system to function more effectively and efficiently through measures that shift passengers from single occupancy vehicle travel. Specifically, TDM encourages using alternative travel modes such as transit, bicycling, walking, promoting alternatives to single occupancy vehicle travel such as carpooling and vanpooling, increasing the number of people and passengers through carpooling and vanpooling, and eliminating the need for some trips altogether, such as a compressed work week or working from home. In terms of equity, MAPC in recent years has made a concerted effort to include equity in our work. I'd like to read just a little bit from our MAPC statement on equity. For MAPC, an equitable Metro Boston is free from discrimination that marginalizes people based on race, sex, religion, disability, national origin, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, family or marital status, income, military status, criminal history, or age. It holds up leaders from marginalized groups and centers the experiences of the disenfranchised. To achieve equity requires acknowledging inequities that persist because of bias, discrimination, and racism, both structural and interpersonal. It requires confronting the historical and present-day factors that have contributed to creating existing disparities, and it requires working actively to eliminate disparities that harm marginalized groups in ways that are unfair, preventable, systematic, and grounded in social, political, and historical factors. And Sandy asked to talk a little bit about some of the examples at MAPC of how we're trying to incorporate equity into our transportation planning work. So just a couple examples, for example, for our works on complete streets, we look to ensure that things such as street trees and bus shelters are not considered as quote unquote amenities, but it really are critical components to provide shade and shelter and improve air quality to people who do not drive, particularly in corridors and communities that have been marginalized by our historical transportation investments. Another way is when we're evaluating the impacts of microtransit, which is a new transit service that is a way to increase coverage and availability to transit in a community. But it typically requires a smartphone, which marginalizes people who cannot afford or do not use a smartphone. It marginalizes sometimes the unbanked, and especially if the apps are only in English. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Sandy and others, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Travis. And Travis has been our steadfast partner in helping to develop this program today. So now I would like to call on my boss, our executive director, Tegan Teich, to give a little bit of an introduction to the Boston Region MPO, its staff, and this event today.
Thanks, Sandy. I really appreciate it. And I'll just say just a short tidbit more before we go on to what you're here for, which is the wonderful speakers we have here today, as well as, of course, to hear from you, the audience, to be part of this conversation. So I just want to say that the MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, is an agency that approves the use of federal funds on transportation projects. That's infrastructure projects, planning work, and we do this for the 97 cities and towns in the Boston region. So it's important because it is, of course, directing funds towards actual what is built and what planning happens. And so we want to make sure we are doing this in a way that is responsible and works towards the region's goals. And like MAPC, which, as Travis said, is a member of the Boston Region MPO board, we as staff really work to convene stakeholders in the region, especially those in the transportation sphere, to talk about the types of topics just like this, like TDM, that are so important in working towards the goals we have for our transportation system, which is to create a robust, equitable, and resilient transportation system. So this is one of those forums that I'm very excited about. Really, any public policy can be either reactive to change, or it can be used to help influence how we are working through this pandemic and recovering to yield a better and really a more just world. And so TDM, again, is one of these ways in which we can talk about how we can accomplish that goal instead of being reactive. So this is the second MPO and MAPC sponsored TDM forum that we've had this year. The first one was in February, and if I am correct, I believe that we'll drop a link into the chat about information about that February conversation. And that conversation was really focused on practical strategies for how TDM can change and really must change as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But one of the themes that emerged from that conversation, which is in line with a lot of other conversations going on around the region, and also, of course, around the country, is how to develop TDM practice overall. That's not just technically proficient, but also equitable in its foundation, and that the practices that are put into place further the goals around social and economic justice by focusing on benefiting those most negatively impacted by our transportation system, which of course is people of color, people with lower incomes, people living with disabilities, and many other populations that we're always striving to better serve. So, so my staff, MAPC staff, worked with our wonderful panelists to create this forum about what it means to have that kind of TDM practice that contributes to equity goals. So with that, I would like to thank you all for being here, especially our speakers, and also handing it back to you, Sandy, also especially for your work as well, and MPO staff in general for pulling this together with MAPC. And I will look forward to him introducing our speakers and getting on with the program. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Tegan. I did mention before, but I just want to add that the MPO operates on a federal fiscal year calendar, which is a October through September calendar. So this event is in fact the very last thing we're doing before transitioning into the new fiscal year and a new set of studies and planning tasks. So I know I personally feel it's a very fitting cap on a year of hard work, despite the numerous challenges for both us and the world. And hopefully looking at a new year and a new time and trying to set some of the values for a brighter future. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers and panelists, and then we'll be off and actually letting them talk, which is the entire point of this event. So Stephanie Grohl is a Transportation Demand Management Planning Officer for the City of Cambridge. She administers the city's PTDM ordinance, which is a national model for reducing single occupancy driver trips. Stephanie will be serving as the lead facilitator for today's discussion. And I also want to thank her for her huge help in recruiting some of the other folks on the panel. Alam Mukahal is a new mobility planner at the Boston Transportation Department. She leads work on revamping the department's TDM transportation development review process, which includes developing a transportation demand management point system and a methodology for maximum parking ratios for new large developments, both of which were recently publicly announced. Tim Chan is a technical project manager for the MBTA and a national expert in TDM. She currently co-chairs TRB's Committee on Transportation Demand Management, as well as sits on the board for the Center for Transportation Demand Management. She has lived and worked in San Francisco, Austin, and Boston. In her 5 years in Austin, she created the City of Austin's first TDM program, implementing new internal commute programs and community-facing programs, and developing local and regional policy. She's also an active member of MBTA's Multicultural Employee Resource Group, Steering Committee, and her department's DEI Committee, so she's very busy. Renee Moore has worked in the bike advocacy industry for over 5 years, gaining experience in outreach, Vision Zero, and community organizing with the Washington Area Bicyclist Association and as a program manager at Bike Arlington. She's passionate about introducing underserved communities to Alexandria's resources, to get them biking, walking, scooting, and using the water taxi and transit more for recreation and transportation. In addition to being the transit specialist for the city of Alexandria, she was recently selected by Amsterdam-based organization BYCS, which is pronounced bikes, to be the bike mayor for the DC region. She's also involved in working with blind bicyclists, deaf bicyclists, bicyclists over 50, and African Americans who want to bike. Dana Rubin is a senior associate with Nelson Nygaard based in Oakland. An advocate of consensus planning, Dana recognizes the importance of engaging with diverse groups of people to improve places based on the perspectives and insights of many. Dana leads the firm's TDM work focused on low-income, public, and affordable housing sites in the Bay Area and manages commute programs for large-scale technology companies and broad regions. Dana authored Nelson Nygaard's brief on equitable TDM that we emailed out earlier this week. Now that we have met our speakers, I know we have people introducing themselves in the chat as well, which is fantastic. And you can share your name, institutional affiliation, if any, where you're joining us from today. And you can also answer the question I'm about to ask our panelists. The first question I want to throw out there is to tell us a bit about what brought you to this conversation about equity and TDM. And I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie to facilitate, but I will just call on Allah first, just randomly, to give us your answer to that question.
As the person kind of working, thanks, Sandy, but as the person kind of really thinking about and working on TDM at the City of Boston, what brought me to equity and TDM, probably more than anything was COVID. While everyone worked at home, essential workers were not working at home. They were in hospitals, in pharmacies, in grocery stores. And so we came up with a program, a pilot, a couple of months ago, focused on providing transit subsidies and blue bike membership subsidies to people who worked in Main Street districts. So people who were working in East Boston Main Street, Mission Hill Main Street, Nubian Square, Fields Corner Main Street, and Jamaica Plain 3 Square. And so that I think was a pretty significant pilot that we conducted. We sent out about 1,000 people transit subsidies and Blue Bikes membership. And what we realized very quickly is that there is a huge demand from low-income workers for transit subsidies in the city.
All right. Thank you, Allah. Stephanie, do you want to pick the next order?
Sure. Renee, let's hear your story.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I came to this work because I had a couple of bike clubs here in Washington, D.C., and they were very diverse. And the Washington Area Bicyclists Association heard about them and was trying to figure out, how do I get all of these different people riding bikes? I didn't really know that I had a secret to it, but they ended up hiring me to lead their Women in Bicycles program, and then into Vision Zero, and then into outreach later. And I found that what was happening is that people were trying to figure out how to become more diverse in their rides. They just noticed that all their rides had a lot of older white men, or it just wasn't diverse. And they were trying to figure out how to do that. And so one of the things that we talked about in planning those events was, where are we putting them? Who's being advertised in them? What do people look like in them? Are we accessible in all the areas? I started things at bike share, started rides beginning at bike share and ending at bike share stations, so that it was more accessible to anybody who wanted to join us on rides. And that just kind of snowballed into why I'm here. And I guess I'm here today because I answered a question on a forum that Stephanie asked, and I had no idea it was going to end up with me speaking on the panel. I was just simply answering a question, but that's how I got here today.
Great. Tim.
Sure. Yeah, so what brought me here today, just really excited to see the regional agencies coming together and pulling together this conversation and this topic. And it is really fascinating to me as a practitioner in the space, and coming from a couple different perspectives, like just thinking back to the work that I have done in planning and in city agency, and just being so focused on the metrics and being so focused on meeting deadlines, and only just starting to look back and think critically about, did I even think about whether the programs I was, shoving through was positively or negatively impacting the communities that I was trying to serve? Did I even think back to say who was actually even at the table when we were making those decisions? And I think I'm just really excited to, not to give myself a hard time, but just to go through that exercise and be able to come out the other end and be a better practitioner and be a better planner. I think in terms of like getting into the equity space, obviously the pandemic and the upsurge in Black Lives Matter, I felt has really given myself a voice in the profession and has made me realize that, my lived experience as a woman, as a Chinese American, is valuable. And it's crazy to think how many years it's taken to kind of figure that out, that my voice is important. And just the experience of working at companies where, they are continue to be led by predominantly white men, and what that means and what that experience means and how we can learn from that moving forward. I think there's just so much to do, and I'm really excited.
Thank you. Dana.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I am at Nelson Nygaard, so unlike others on the panel, I have a little bit of a different lens where I'm coming in, where I have an opportunity to work with many cities and kind of look at precedents and what cities and towns are doing what, and doing my best job to introduce really great, excellent practices to other places. Often I work with developers who give me a call or my colleagues a call, and they need to fulfill a TDM requirement because of a policy or ordinance. And I think it was coming into a cycle where we were getting requests of, I need to put together a plan, and not to generalize all developers, but I work with many developers in the affordable housing space and market rate. And there was definitely a question coming up of, why are you doing a TDM plan? It shouldn't be just to check a box. There needs to be so much more. Like, let's back up a little bit. Let's think about why these plans are important and not just about fulfilling a policy. So over the last several years, really thinking critically about the purpose of developers writing TDM plans and employers for their employees and their residents. And at the end of the day, wanting those plans to be plans about access and getting people to where they need to go affordably and effectively, and not just about kind of checking a box in order to meet their city requirements. So there's been a lot of discussion about that. It's been really exciting to see this space kind of changing the starting line a little bit. And I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation, to continue adding kind of better best practices, feeling like we can all move really confidently in the same direction. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you. So Sandy, to answer your question for myself, I've been working in sustainable transportation for many years, and I kind of thought that the work I do benefits everybody, because isn't it good for everyone if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce traffic? But the more I allowed myself to question equity in the TDM field, the more I doubted my approach. I think I'm having some similar feelings that Tim has been having. So over the last couple of years, I've made efforts to be more intentional about the voices that I've sought out. So I hear a more diverse set of perspectives than I have in the past. So a lot of the questions today come from the conversations that I've had with people over the last few years. And I also want to thank the person who was on the last MPO forum call who asked the group about TDM for people with disabilities. And, you know, I'm doing all this work in equitable mobility planning. And the best answer I could think of in that moment was that infrastructure needs to be in place and that snow needs to be cleared from sidewalks. And that's just not good enough. So I really realized that I had put TDM somehow outside the equity conversation. And for today's conversation, you know, we as TDM professionals are in the business of offering solutions. Like, what can we do to increase equity in TDM? It's going to be very tempting to go there, but I think it's worth taking a moment to pause and spend some time going deep into thinking about how inequities show up in TDM before we talk about solutions. So, you know, for these panelists today, we don't see this panel as a place to tick down all the answers for how to do equity in TDM. It's more like a brainstorm session between people who've worked in TDM and have been thinking a lot about these issues. So it's just a first step. And we begin this work by reflecting on some potentially hard questions. So let's get started. Renee, can you start us off by defining diversity and equity and talking about how they are different?
Sure. So usually when I talk about this, I always start here so that we all have the same working definition, because what I've noticed when I started working in this field is that people were throwing around the word equity a lot. It was like the buzzword. It still is. Every time I go to a conference, there's an equity panel, there's an equity theme. And what I started to realize is that people really mean diversity. I think that because they don't have diversity, first of all, but they're thinking they should have equity somewhere. And so I want to always start out defining it. So one of the ways, I like analogies, so work with me on this one, please. And I think I sent this one to Stephanie when she first posed her question. I love to bake cakes. I don't like to eat them. It's a weird quirk I have, but I do love to bake them. I take them to work when we were meeting in person. So one of the things when you bake a cake, you'll notice there's certain ingredients that go in. There's eggs, there's some liquid, it may be milk or 7-Up or something that goes in it. And there's sugar, there's butter, there's flour, there's vanilla, things like that. They all go in different amounts, and that's your diversity. You need all of those ingredients in order to make it. So you just can't make a cake with just eggs. You don't have a cake with just milk. You don't have it with just butter. And then once you bake that cake, you have this wonderful cake that comes out. It's all baked together and it's a beautiful cake. What often happens though, when I see inequity, is that people will decide at the end, I'm sorry, let me step back. You bake this cake, and at the end, when it comes out, you can decide if you want to frost it. And the frosting, I know this could be argued either way, but the frosting is optional. You don't have to have the frosting. Some people may say that makes the cake. I won't argue with you, but it is optional. And so when I look at equity and diversity, what I notice people doing in TDM is they've had a whole system built. They have this whole cake and they're just trying to throw some frosting on top of it and make it equitable. And you can't really do that. That's kind of like trying to shove the eggs in at the end of the cake if you forgot it. Like, you have to build all that stuff in together to have an equitable system. So when I look at equity, I look at all the diverse things that go into it to build it into one beautiful cake or one beautiful whatever it is you're building. You can't just walk up later and go, oh, you know what, this needs to taste better. Or we need some equity. Let's throw some financial things at them. Let's make this other program for this. You can't do that. Then that's why people are frustrated. It's not working, because they're frosting something that's already made instead of putting that in when they're making the cake.
Thank you. So let's talk about what our goals are in the field of TDM, and what sort of goals do we as a group think are missing from traditional TDM goals. And, we can just unmute and have a conversation. So go right ahead. Dana.
I'll give it a whirl.
Okay.
I'm thinking a lot about this, in that I think traditionally TDM goals, they've been very narrow. Yes, we want to reduce greenhouse gases, very critical, extremely important, and meet city goals around climate change and mitigation. However, the way TDM has been set up, and I think many people on this call know this, is that it's pretty narrow in who it serves and who benefits from TDM programs. And so I think it could be really exciting to challenge the status quo of what, and Tim was speaking a little bit this in your intro, just, how are we evaluating programs? What are we deeming something a TDM program? When is it successful? And what are the goals? A lot of great organizations and institutions, I think Greenlining a couple years back kind of was thinking about an equity framework, and I try to think about it in my day-to-day is initial goals should really be about accessibility and safety, and then other goals around greenhouse gas emissions really do follow. But I think that there are basic goals that sometimes TDM hasn't hit really well before, that I hope that we can strive to be better about at making the clearest goal. And that's getting everybody, not just those that work in that 9 to 5 bracket, to and from where they need to go to work and to their other essential services.
I think one of the things that I find missing in TDM is an education piece. I feel like we all think if everyone gets out of their car, they'll naturally go to something else. And maybe, but what I do find is that if you want people to bike or use bike share, do you want them to use transit? Do they know how to use it? I think there's an assumption that people just know how to take a bus. I mean, maybe they don't. Maybe they're scared. They don't know where to get on. They don't know where to get off. They don't know what the schedule is. They don't know how long they're going to be waiting. If you take people out of their car and you want to put them on bike or bike share, do they have the stuff that they need if it decides it's going to pour down raining or it's going to snow or it's a really hot day and I don't have clothes at work to change into? I think there's those elements of that we're not talking about that help to make the transition easier from getting out of my car and doing something else. And there's simple things like, do I need a backpack? Do I need a poncho? Do I need umbrella this day? How do I carry my lunch? And we don't really think about that. We just assume that if we give people certain things, like if we just drop it in a city, people will go, oh, I'll use that. I'm just going to abandon my car and take this mode of transportation. And I think there has to be a way to set that up so that people will do that, because there is a process into doing it. They have to start thinking about it. And the easy thing to do right now is to get in your car. I know where I'm going. I know where to park. I know how much it's going to cost. If I have to start thinking, I've got to get up an hour early and get on a bus or get on my bike, people won't do it because ultimately we're lazy. Like we're just, as much as we hate to say that, we're lazy. So we don't want to think about that if we don't have to. But if you educate people and show them that it's a little bit easier to make the transition, you can get there. You can get work done. You can read a book. You can get through your podcast. You aren't frustrated, but you show them how to do that. They may decide that, you know what, doing this does make my life a little bit easier.
There's also like the technicalities of implementing TDM that is just so much easier for employers with entire HR departments, right? It's much more difficult to go to a small business and say, hey, can you participate in a pre-tax benefit? They don't have time to think about that. They're trying to survive in the middle of a pandemic. They don't have time to think about how their employees are coming in. If their employees are working 12-hour days, or they're working from, if they're closing shop or opening shop, people generally aren't gonna necessarily want to take like the bus or get a bike share at 6 a.m. That's not something that's like on the forefront of people's mind. What's on the forefront of people's mind is paying the bills, surviving a pandemic, and keeping the business open. And so it's much easier to go to a large institution or a large employer with 100 more employers with entire HR departments and say, just enroll all your employees in this pre-tax transit benefit. And like, I get a pre-tax transit benefit and I never have to think about it. I never have to think about reloading my Charlie card or my T-Pass. I never have to think about, oh, it's the end of the month. I don't have to think about putting money on it. I don't have to think about getting a new one. It's preloaded. It comes to me, and all I have to do is sit down while it comes to me naturally. So maybe there's a part of it that, like, sure, people tend to do what's easier, but it's a part of it is like, who has time to think about it if there's an entire HR department behind you thinking these things and doing these things for you?
I'd love to respond to both Renee and Ala. Renee, the point you made about taking a step back and making sure the fundamentals are there and educating. I think that kind of aligns with like thinking about quantitative metrics that we've traditionally used, like VMT reduction and reduced vehicle trips, and thinking a little more holistically about more qualitative metrics. And when I was in Austin, we started going there, trying to like think about the neighborhood-based education programs we were doing and saying like, we are not gonna be able to measure reduction in vehicle trips on a neighborhood-based education program, but maybe we can do community surveying where we ask about like level of comfort. Like, what's your current level of comfort of taking the bus? And after the program, what's your level of comfort after? So that the whole concept of behavior nudging, and that you're kind of moving along a spectrum versus, great, implemented the program, now I never drive. Like that, we just can't be realistic about it. And we can't set ourselves up for these unrealistic metrics that we're not going to meet. And another, thinking about talking about like, small companies that just don't have the time to do this because they don't have the capacity. So we go for the low-hanging fruit. We're like, well, we need numbers. Let's just go to this big company and we can say 5,000 people enrolled in this program, or we just need people to sign up for this transit subsidy. I wonder if part of the metrics we can think about is not an end goal metrics, but like metrics we meet as we're framing the program. Like defining success of a program maybe starts at the beginning of who is the makeup, and sure, like at the end of the day, something will happen. People will have learned, or people get bus passes or sign up for bike share, but like maybe we need to define specific goals or metrics or milestones for these points so that we don't get so far into program development without having those initial goals in mind.
Yep. So I would like to hear what you all think we gain by making TDM more equitable. So aside from more equity being a good thing in general, does equity serve our traditional TDM goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in traffic? Does increasing equity serve those goals?
I can go 100%. And the reason for that is when we think about equity in terms of TDM, we suddenly have to think about non-downtown areas and have to think about areas outside the most well-served portions of a city as much as we think about downtown. We suddenly have to think about small, not just small businesses, but even like, bodegas and convenience stores and, local shops, as much as we think about the MGHs and New Balances and Reeboks, right? And so how do we structure something that is currently right now so focused on large economic centers in Boston? That would be, Longwood Medical Area, downtown, Seaport. Those are basically the big three. And of course, there's little ones here and there. How do we capture where people are going in areas that aren't as well served by transit? I don't think the solution is purely a TDM solution or a citywide transit subsidy. It doesn't hurt. We definitely need a low income program here for transit in the city of Boston. That's my plug for the MBTA. Hey guys. And other things like that. We definitely need a low income program for sure. But we also need to think about, where are we investing in infrastructure? And I don't want to end up like for this to be a conversation just on infrastructure, right? But how do we decide where key bus routes or priority bus lanes are going? How do we decide where bike lanes are going? How do we decide if we want people to use TDM? TDM is the flip side of infrastructure, right? So if we want people to switch modes or to make use of a bike share subsidy or a transit subsidy or, whatever else, carpool, car share, whatever, we have to also think about how our infrastructure investments are being prioritized. It opens up a whole box that we've never really think about, right? We suddenly have to think about as we're baking the cake in the very beginning, right? We can't just, after we've sliced it up and frosted it, we have to like, okay, from scratch, from the very beginning, from the beginning of putting in a bike lane or a bus lane.
I love when people use my analogies right away. I totally agree with what Allah says. And when I was thinking about this question, is where do we put things? Where do we put the bike share? And does the bike share go to some place people want to go? Are they in the neighborhoods where people live so that they can get to wherever it is they want to be? Or are all the bike share stations in the downtown area? Or are they already at the train stations? That doesn't make sense if you need to get to the train station. So you won't use bike share if you do that. I also think when I think about making it equitable, I think that I feel like when planners redesign roads, that they should have to bike it, walk it, drive it, and be on it in a bus. You need to see it from every angle. I have been on some streets where I thought clearly they designed this from their computer and they've never ever stepped on the street. This looks ridiculous. The walk signals are short. And when I think about equitable, I think about someone who does have a disability who isn't able to cross the street quickly enough because the walk signal comes on at the same time everyone is turning. And so that person who has a disability or that person who's older who doesn't move quickly is not going to be able to get across that. And suddenly you have crashes and you just have all this conflict there, and it doesn't have to be that way. So when I think about it being more equitable, I do think of things like, would people walk here? Is there a sidewalk there? Do the signals work? Do the bike lanes make sense? Do they connect to something that people want to go to? If you're on the bus, can people get from their neighborhood to where they want to be? So all of that makes it equitable. And housing. So when we think about it, I think sometimes we try to take TDM and take it out of all the other stuff. But in most cities, most big cities, gentrification is going on. And so if people are being moved out of their area into suburbs, they're going to drive because they don't have access to some of the things that they used to have when they lived in the city. So you have to consider all of that when you're looking at being equitable in TDM.
So if we're mainly focused on, how to get able-bodied white-collar workers who already feel secure in any mode out of their cars, how are our TDM programs affecting people who do not fall into those categories? People who are already outside what we're going for? What effects are we having on those people? When, for instance, we require 100% market rate paid parking at a site, which is great for getting people out of their cars.
I think this is a particularly difficult question for folks who have been in the TDM space for a while, and pricing parking is like always the obvious solution, and you're so focused on that, and you're so focused on the low cost of gasoline over the years, and the low gas tax, and how you need to like bring up make the costs of transportation equitable. I don't have an answer except to acknowledge that I think it's really, really important for us as practitioners to step away from these really obvious solutions that we've either been taught in school or taught in practice, or have written in plans and have given to our clients or have implemented in our own space. I think to Renee's point of like, we need to step in other people's shoes and not just be the planner, and think about not centering on the white collar worker who works 9 to 5, and think about all other people who have, what I said in the beginning, like starting to think about how have our programs negatively impacted communities that we were, intending to serve and didn't serve correctly. Maybe someone else has an answer though.
I agree so much with that. And I want to actually elevate someone, Stacy, in the chat. I think maybe it's okay. I really appreciate the comment you just shared in this chat, is that often those that rely on transit, they're already taking transit. They're just maybe not getting the same financial benefit. They're already using the service. And so it's such a, like that I find, that's the disappointment. It's like they're, it is not, you're not creating an inclusive TDM if those that are already taking transit cannot, they're looking for a financial benefit. And so kind of breaking down the structures, yes, so much of, how often have we seen that menu of TD options that I feel guilty as a consultant kind of sharing this list of TDM strategies that we know, and when no, I think we should really push back on that, go in with a blank slate and ask community what they need and how to support them, rather than funneling TDM strategies that are outdated. And yeah, absolutely, I fully agree.
Okay, I'm just trying to give people enough time to talk if you want to chime in. So please, if I start to ask the next question, go ahead and break in and tell me you want to go back to the previous question. Okay, so let's talk about representation. So many people who work in TDM and transportation planning are white. I don't think that'll be a surprise to anybody. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about why it's important to diversify the field.
Okay, I'll take that one. I believe it's important, going back to the point I made about when planners design roads and streets. I think it's important because if you don't have all of those voices in the room, people who are blind, people who are deaf, someone who has a physical disability, people who are older and may not walk as fast, people who are younger and don't walk as fast. I mean, when you have all those people in a space talking about their experience in their neighborhood, in their world, you have a totally different perspective of it, as opposed to if you are an able-bodied white planner. So you'll see that in some areas, like I live in Washington, D.C., I mentioned before, and I live in an area called East of the River. It's a mostly Black population here. The sidewalks are not as beautiful as when you go to the other side of town. We don't have as much bike share here. We have a car share program, but the cars don't end up here as much as they end up on the other across the river. So when you look at that, and when you look at what they design, and when planners do come and redesign things, oftentimes the plan comes to us. It's not really, as Dana said, it's not really that people ask us, like, what do you want? And, the people may say, we just want a stop sign right here on Alabama Avenue. And then what we'll get is a bike lane. Like, no one asked for that. Like, why are we getting a bike lane? And it's not that people are against it. It's that we really want a stop sign. We really want a stoplight there. And so bringing in that representation and having people share with you what they think is best for the neighborhood because they live there and they see it is really important. And so if someone says, I'm an older person, and I say this with my mom had a stroke a few years ago. And one of the things she told me, she lives here in the city. She said, I don't do things in the city because I can't cross the street fast enough. That's really sad that she feels that way. She says, I can't get across that street in 15 seconds. And she can't. She's right. She walks with a limp and a cane, and she can't. So when you're thinking about it from that perspective, as someone who's not able-bodied, someone who is older, you will think about designing the street a little differently than you will for someone who's 30 and can get across, who can run across the street. So I think that's why diversity and representation matter so much in planning when we start to put things together in TDM.
I mean, it feels absolutely critical. Like we've been doing it, like this field and all of the fields within the sector of transportation and beyond require this diversity of voices and perspective, because we'll end up having to fix the program or going to implement the wrong thing. And I've been reflecting on I was working in the Bayview neighborhood of San Francisco, and the developer asked to update the TDM plan, very standard practice. And we worked directly with the residents to say, what do you want? What do you want your TDM plan to say? And we tried really hard to not give them that TDM menu that I think is like classically shown. And we learned, you know, the members of the residents and the community said, we'd love if the bus stop could just shift from being on the public road to right into our neighborhood, because it will feel safer and we'll take it more often. That wouldn't have come up in on the consultant team or the third party coming up with the plan. And it was a small change that made a huge difference in those feeling comfortable and safe taking their local route. And it feels like it's unacceptable now to give boxed in choices when the communities and residents and employees know what they want to improve their transportation. It feels insincere, I think, at this point, to not have the right voices speaking up for what they need in transportation. I think it's our job, particularly as private consultants coming in, I'll continue labeling myself that because I am, to say, how can we get there for you? How can we facilitate that? How can we make it happen?
Okay, so TDM professionals love a good survey.
I would love to jump in real quick.
Oh, please do, yeah.
I 100% agree with Renee and Dana, and I think it's also really important to kind of take a step back and reflect that our profession just has been steeped in racism over its history. I mean, redlining is the obvious example of that. But for us to be able to kind of like slowly fundamentally shift and right the wrongs of all kind of the how our profession has such a history of racism, we are going to need those diverse voices to really frame that conversation and kind of carry us forward. I also think it's really important to note that diversity is only the first step. Like, you can't just hire one Black planner and one Asian planner and be like, sweet, you know, we're done. Let's take this photo op, make sure it's on the front cover of the report. It is just a first step. You know, you need to, when you hire these folks, you need to give them the tools to actually feel like they're empowered and able to do the work and not feel tokenized. And there's just so much, you know, getting from the first step of diversity to actually making a change is it's not a checkbox. But yeah, I agree, we need it.
Tim, thank you so much for saying that. Also, please don't hand us all the Black work or all the Asian communities. Like, that is not our job to do all of that work for you. Just don't do it. I can say that from experience, just don't.
All right, so let's talk about surveys. Raise your hand if you love a good survey. I do. But do our surveys ask the right questions? And if not, then what questions should we be asking? And who should we be trying to reach with our surveys? If it's not just the white collar workers who we're trying to get to move on to transit, biking, and walking.
I think sometimes the problem with TDM surveys is the problem with TDM, period. It's much easier to just reach out to HR and ask them to blast this to everybody on their email list it's much more difficult to go to a train stop or a bus stop and stand there and ask people to actually fill out surveys. And so I think in order to really get a good TDM survey and be able to do it in a way that is get a representative sample and not just only office workers, which we've done. We've only surveyed office workers because that's just low-hanging fruit, or university workers, hospital workers. It actually requires just going onto these bus stops, train stops, community meetings. We've had meetings where when I ask employers what they want, and then small businesses in particular what they're looking for, and then I ask employees what they want, it's two very different answers. And so thinking about who gets those surveys and where we're meeting them, whether we're going directly to their place of employment, particularly for places that don't have an email listserv, I think is pretty critical and not something we think about enough, to be honest.
I think there can be a lot of value in surveys, but I think we definitely have an opportunity to recreate what a traditional survey is. That can be, because sometimes the most valuable information comes from a few voices that have been at an employment center for a while, or living in the residency at their house, their apartment for a while, and can be a voice for multiple people. So focus groups, more qualitative data, not just kind of the like straight format survey, and also thinking about how that information can be distributed. I think there can be a lot of value surveys, and it should just be paired, kind of partnered with other type of data and information that's coming in. In a few instances, we're starting to kind of co-write surveys with kind of resident councils or employee councils, where it can be co-authored by those that are required to write the TDM plan or implement a TDM program with those that are going to enjoy the TDM offerings. So I think that there can be some kind of cross-pollination that we haven't seen before in the land of the survey.
All right, so let's switch gears and talk a little bit about accessibility. So people living with physical and cognitive disabilities themselves, or with family members who have a disability, might find it harder to shift out of private cars and into transit, walk, bike, or carpool. So how do you think about including people with disabilities in your TDM work in ways that maybe you haven't already talked about?
When I've thought about this, and this isn't, I've go back. So I've taken sign language, and I've learned that people who are deaf do not consider a disability. But I'm going to say this part of it is that when I've done bike rides, and what I've done when I've had bike rides or we've had events that we're having people at, making sure that I have someone who knows sign language there who can sign, or putting videos with captions in it so that they can follow along with the video. When I've worked with blind bicyclists, when I do TDM work, I'm thinking about if someone's doing planning on a street, do the walk signals say something so that people know to walk if they can't see. So I think about it in terms of that. So at least in walking and biking, I haven't gotten much into transit with this or carpool, but that's what I think about when I think of someone who has a physical disability. And like I said, like someone like my mom who walks slower, I think about, can the signals be longer so that the person can get across? Can they do the Barnes dance in DC? They'll only do it if there's a certain number of people who cross the street when they survey, but I don't know why they can't do it everywhere, to be honest. Like everybody just walk and they stop and everybody drive and everybody walk. I don't really see how that holds anybody up, but I'm also not a city planner. But when I look at it, I think what really holds, to me, what holds people up is people who are walking when, on the walk signal, when people are trying to turn and everybody's, just kind of in a conflict. So I think if everybody could just walk, then they go, and then all the cars go. I'm not really sure why that can't be implemented, but what do I know? I think it would make life easier.
I think the way we're as a city of Boston kind of thinking about accessibility is similar to how we're thinking about low income and affordability in TDM. So, for example, on affordability, we very specifically say we recently released a TDM point system, and we specifically say in the TDM point system, and as well as maximum parking ratios, we say, we expect affordable housing developments to abide by these ratios in TDM point system, but it shouldn't be an excuse to stop an affordable housing development. And if the maximum parking ratios and the TDM point system become so burdensome that they stop the affordable housing development, then we're going to grant an exception, right? When we think about low income and parking pricing, for example, we had, when we worked with Stantec and Allison Simmons on developing TDM point system, we put in very specific language to say that you can charge only up to a certain point for parking. And if the employee who's paying for parking makes, 70% of the AMI or lower, I think we put some language in there around that, then we basically at some point stop charging them for the parking, right? So how do we incorporating, I feel like the devil is in the details. And so how do we incorporating these things in how we're implementing traditional and non-traditional TDM programming? And in fact, on Monday, I'm going to be meeting with Tim so she could tell me how we can make sure that the real-time feeds that we're requiring developments to do are ADA accessible, are accessible by the blind, for the blind, and for anybody else who's differently abled. And so, making sure that we're working together and really making sure that we're that the submission requirements and the monitoring portion and all of that it's baked into, right? Going back to the baked into analogy, but is baked into the both traditional TDM programs, which, they work sometimes, and the non-traditional. And I'm going to go ahead and plug in the TDM point system in the chat.
I'll also just to say that I think there are great opportunities to pilot ideas, particularly around making sure that TDM programs are inclusive and focused on ADA and accessibility in ways that they maybe haven't been before. So testing and trying and modifying, I think, can have much longer term benefits and outcomes than maybe rolling out a program that may not be effective. So I've been inspired by cities that are kind of testing ideas, testing some technology, going back to some traditional TDM, but also trying to use really creative solutions, shuttle systems, ADA buses that are compliant, buses that are ADA compliant, things like that, that haven't necessarily been trialed before, to see what pilots stick and which ones need to be modified.
Yeah, and I forget who said this about how now bilingual pamphlets and surveys are commonplace. The hope is that it will be commonplace for us to think about disabilities, and maybe it will become commonplace to always have a sign language interpreter at our TDM program events. Like, these are the things that we are hoping for, that it just becomes embedded in our thinking and isn't the icing on the cake anymore.
So can we just talk about jargon for a minute? So accessibility experts say that if all we did was make it easy for people to understand transportation information, that would be a huge improvement. Can you talk about what we lose when we speak in jargon and acronyms so much in this industry?
I mean, the acronym TDM in of itself, like any term that you have to, every time you say TDM, have to define it and explain it is not the right term to use. I've been really excited to see cities embracing kind of simple terminology, commute strategies, transportation options, something that the public feels that accessible language to them. I think internally, if city planners, public agencies want to continue using TDM or internal jargon, sure, I won't push against that too much, but it's our jobs as TDM practitioners and professionals to market and communicate transportation strategies effectively. And I don't think TDM is the right wording to do that. And I would be excited if a coalition comes out of this to embrace maybe some new language around what this sector of transportation planning really is about.
And I totally agree with Dana on this. And not only is it like jargon for the public, but honestly, it's jargon even when we're engaging developers, brokers, architects, and other, more specialized stakeholders. Like at the beginning of every presentation that I have on TDM, I have to define TDM and I have to be very specific to tell people like this is not infrastructure. That doesn't mean we're not doing infrastructure, but this is to support. And it's like you're just wasting time, like, right? Like instead of just finding a word that makes sense that can click for people, I'm just here spending time explaining what TDM is, what TAPA is, what TMAs are, what T everything is, right? So yeah, I'd be very excited for a new word or a replacement word. So
I completely agree with Dana and Olive. One of my former directors used to say, unpack your acronyms. So I'm really big on explaining that because I work for the city of Alexandria now. We have acronyms everywhere. And I'm often sitting in meetings like, what's a DPI? What's a SUP? What's a SP? And you shouldn't have to do that at your job all the time. And I understand when we're working amongst ourselves that there are things that just make it easier. But I agree with Dana. I think when we go out into the public and we're doing outreach, we need to make that language simpler so that people at least understand what we're talking about. And oftentimes it's so ingrained in us to say, oh, I'm a TDM specialist. And they're like, what is that? And then you have to make this title sound really fancy and important to people, but you have to spend so much time, like Allah says, just explaining what you do that you can't even get into or explain what that term means or that acronym means. You can't even get into what you're there to do and help people with. So it definitely alienates a lot of people when we don't speak in English. And I don't know why we're making it so hard. I don't know why we found ways to, like scooters, for some reason they're, shared mobility devices. Why aren't they just scooters? I just don't understand this. Like, just call it a scooter. It's 2 extra words we don't need to say. So yeah, I think we definitely alienate people when we do that. Just make it simpler.
Yeah. From my perspective, I feel like, so this conversation like comes and goes over the years, and the arguments are always so valid. And at the same time, it's so hard to break away from it. I think part of it is, maybe it is what Dana is saying is like, fine, we can like be nerdy in our own space because we do, or I feel like I want a term where like in my nerdy space, I can say it once and understand like who's in my sphere of people who understand what's going on, and in a way where I can like advocate when it comes to like advocating for funding or advocating for policy change. It is much harder to do that if it's like even explaining like transportation options. So it's a simpler word, but it still doesn't like encompass everything we do. So like from a nerdy perspective, I still like want to hold on to it, even though, and I think Ben mentioned this, people think I'm a modeler half the time. I'm like at conferences, I'm like, don't talk to me about modeling. That's not what I do. I'm conflicted. I understand both perspectives, and I'm kind of on that train of what Dana is saying. Like I hold on to it from a professional perspective, and I try really hard not to say it anywhere else in day-to-day work.
That all makes so much sense to me. Okay, so we're going to move on to some other planning issues that support or make it hard for people to choose sustainable options. So you guys ready for some harder questions? Okay, so for some people, cars are safety devices. So how can we aim to reduce car dependence without also focusing on gun violence and the systemic inequalities that cause people to participate in gun violence?
Stephanie, would you mind repeating the question? I think it's just helpful.
Okay. So, just remembering that for some people, cars do serve as safety devices on the street. They feel most safe when they're in a private car, potentially even with darkened windows, so they are not seen. How can we how can we as TDM professionals hope to reduce car dependence? How can that be like such an important goal without also focusing on gun violence and the systemic inequalities that cause people to participate in gun violence?
What's coming up for me is that transportation demand management is one branch, one prong of so many other townwide, citywide, regional, national issues, and that we can be effective TDM practitioners and at the same time need to be thinking really thoughtfully about other broader issues. And I think they can work cohesively, but we can't, as TDM practitioners, we'll try to implement and encourage people to get out of their cars. And at the same time, I think need to be advocates for other really critical issues in and across our society. And hopefully that those two things can come together. And ultimately, at the end of the day, someone and a person's and a community's safety, I think, is our utmost responsibility. And I don't want to deny that of it to anybody.
I guess I would want to think about the question in a more general sense, maybe from like just safety in general, and thinking about how different people perceive safety very differently when it comes to transportation and how we interact with transportation and interact with space. And it goes back to kind of the diversity of people that we are leaning on to make these choices and to evaluate these programs and to create these programs. Because if you are a white man thinking about transportation options, there are things that you're not going to think about that a woman would, or that a person of color would, walking down the streets. And safety is so important from those different lenses. And I don't think there's, again, I don't have an answer. I'm just thinking that it again is just one component where we need people of color in our space. We need more women in this space to talk about safety and how it impacts the decisions we make to take public transit or to bike at night or whatever it is, or to be somewhere where, police are present. Yeah, that's all I'm thinking about.
If anybody else wants to respond, please go ahead. But I think we should try and do one more question and then move on to the Q&A section, if that's possible.
Okay. All right, one more question. So I have a lot more questions, so I'll just pick one here. How do mobility needs change as a person goes through the many stages of raising children? So from infancy all the way through raising your kids to adult.
That's a good one. I think that depends on where that could depend on where you live. So if you live in an area that is, you know, a downtown area, like Ala mentioned, where we tend to put a lot of things, you might be able to get a child around very easily because there's a lot of stuff there already. There may be a childcare there, your job might be there, you can walk to it, or you can bike your kid to school. So that makes it a little bit easier to live in certain places. In other parts, as your child grows up, you may realize that you might need a car more because maybe they're involved in a lot of sports that are in a different part of town and you have to get them there quickly, and transit may not work for them, or you don't trust your child to be on transit by themselves yet because they're kids, not because anything's going to happen to them, but because they're children and they just wander, you know. So it could be something like that. And then as they grow up and get older, you may trust them to do, you know, to be on transit by themselves or to bike on their own. So that's an interesting question. When I was raising my daughter, I felt like I always needed a car. And I just had a car because it was easy to get her to daycare, get her to school and pick her up. And we also lived in Texas at the time. There's like kind of no such thing as walking in Texas. So you drive everywhere. And then as she got older, we moved back here to DC, and she was able to take Metro to get to school and take the bus to get to school. And she walked and she did all those things. And now that she's an adult, she has a baby and she has a car. I told her when she told me she was pregnant, I said, I'm getting a cargo bike. So so I'm like, that's how I'm getting the baby around. So I can see how it changes, but I think it changes depending on how close you are to transit, biking, walking, and things that you need to get to versus living somewhere where maybe that's not as accessible, but also it's easy to just put a kid in a car. And so you do what's easiest. You put them in a car seat, pull them out the car seat and go. And so that's how, that's oftentimes how we think. We also think it's safer than putting them on a bike or walking with them somewhere.
Yeah, I'll add as a former Texan as well. I tried to live car free for a bit. And then when I was pregnant, we caved and purchased one car. So I do get that kind of just like the different stages of life, like just realizing even as like a passionate transportation planner that you're like, oh, fine, my child comes first. And getting that car. But then again, like as they get older, like thinking about, how can I teach my child to take public transit? Do I feel safe? Is there good infrastructure where I feel safe biking with my child? So, we invested in a cargo bike and we do feel safe and we practice biking, but also, talking about like being close to daycare, being close to school. Like I had the privilege to be able to make that choice to live somewhere where I could bike or I could get on a bus to take my child to school. And not everyone has that privilege. And sometimes it is a choice that people can make and sometimes it isn't.
I'm not a parent. However, I do, there are a lot of mothers in my life, and this often is coming up for their careers, and navigating transportation as a woman is very different from a man, and how we've planned has been often for a man versus a woman. And I think that's something that we should be better about integrating into our practices. And it goes into the prior conversations we've had on this call of making sure we're taking in the perspectives of many and seeing problems through multiple lenses. And that goes kind of back to TDM programming in general, not just kind of considering who's traveling during that 9 to 5, but often the person who's the parent running those errands and kind of needing to go to multiple places during the day, drop off kids, do this, run errands and essential services. Can we factor in TDM programming into those types of trips and kind of get out of the mindset that TDM is just for a worker who is going to a set place? But can we create types of infrastructure and programming that is so much more beyond the workday?
All right, we have a lot of work to do. Sandy, do you
Cool.
wanna-
Yeah, no, this has been terrific, very informative, and lots of important things being brought up. And thank you, Stephanie, for facilitating. And thank you, everybody, for all of your contributions. I know we said that this is going to go until 5:30. I am happy to keep the discussion going for as long as our panelists are able to stay. I do want to turn now to some questions from the audience, some of which were collected in advance from the registration form, and some of which we got from folks in the chat during the discussion. And I want to, I'll go through it in no particular order, and we'll get to as many as we're able to. But I want to take a little bit of event organizer's prerogative and ask my own question first, which has been, I've learned a lot from this. And I think we talked a lot today about building relationships and trust and educating and all these things that help to work equitably. These take time, right? It takes time to build real positive relationships with folks. And to be able to actually get to know people and hear their concerns and have them trust you so they can tell you what they're really thinking. So how do you, any one of you or collectively, kind of think about balancing taking the time, and it is extensive, necessary to do that kind of work versus the urgency of the goals that TDM practitioners are often trying to meet, such as progress on climate change or road safety, or is that in fact a false binary?
I'm going to pull a Dana. Can you repeat that one more time? It was a very long question. I want to make sure that I try to answer the question.
Sure. Sorry for the long question. Basically, I'm asking if doing TDM work or any planning work equitably takes a long time. It's something that involves a lot of thinking and talking and process. Is there a conflict with the urgency of the other goals that we're trying to meet about combating things such as road safety and combating climate change?
Absolutely not. The reason for that is, for example, in Boston, the area with the highest air pollution is of people of color. And that is a people of color area. And that's because the highway is right there. And if we want to reduce the amount of commuters that are coming from outside of Boston and going on these highways and going to downtown, we have to be really aggressive in our TDM. I know we need to get better at developing the nuances of TDM strategies and equity and getting into the nitty-gritty and really being tailoring it. But reducing greenhouse gas emissions is about equity. It is about, because the people who are suffering the most from it, from air pollution, from getting the worst of it is in places like East Boston, dealing with rising sea levels, or in places like Chinatown dealing with the air pollution. So it's yeah, totally false binary. Thanks for the out, Sandy.
I obviously really appreciate TDM. I'm on this panel and have been enjoying these conversations and drank the Kool-Aid on TDM a long time ago. However, sometimes I do feel that TDM, we know where we want to go long term. For me, that would be free transit, something bigger, more regional, large sweeping change in terms of programs, rather than sometimes it can be really fragmented, siloed changes within the TDM space. And so I think if we need to escalate TDM expansion and in with the intention of escalating climate mitigation, I feel like the sweet spot is being more radical, doing those things like introducing free transit. So, because I think more than anything, free transit and those types of programs are incredibly equitable and inclusive, more so than some of the piecemeal programs that we have to offer, can reach both of our goals more efficiently and effectively by meeting those climate change goals with some real sweeping programmatic changes that can be regional. And I mean, it would be fantastic if that was national, but that kind of cuts into federal, how dollars are spent, which I don't think we hit that question today. But that would be really an exceptional way to progress both of those goals for TDM and climate mitigation to meet.
Yeah, I'll just add to Dana's point that I feel like these big, like really big, impactful things that are federal or regional based is like, I don't know, like trying to end racism, trying to solve world hunger. And I want us as practitioners to not be paralyzed by that. Like, just because maybe at times the type of work we do seems small scale or not as impactful as advocating for universal free transit. It doesn't mean it's not important. And so I don't want people to come away from here saying, oh, the work I do isn't good, or I can't make a change. I think we can. Like, I really think taking an incremental step is really important. And it's really important for us to try to take that first step and not be overwhelmed by this concept of equity in the transportation space, but know that it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a lot of resiliency and continued effort on each of our parts. But that's like kind of like in the background, and in the immediacy, you can still do things to make you feel like you're doing good work, because we are doing good work. So just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate that.
All right, thank you. I have a lot to chew on in response to my question. So I think Dina especially touched on how TDM is often siloed. I think, to use one word for it, away from other systems of transportation, of housing, of land use, of social justice in all kinds of ways. And we got several questions in the chat about basically that question, which is, how do we connect TDM in equitable ways to other systems within government or other elements of society? Are there particular ones that are important? Are there particular ways we should be thinking about that? So if anybody wants to take that question on. Kind of broad, I know.
I think oftentimes when I'm explaining TDM, I fail to mention the secondary benefits of TDM programs that, frankly, I think might actually be the primary benefits of transportation demand management. And that's accessibility of getting to school, getting to your jobs, having opportunities to grow your education, could do all of these things that without transportation, you may not be able to pursue. And perhaps we're leaving that out of the dialogue too much. And I think it's been a kind of reminder to myself that when I'm explaining TDM programs and commute programs and all of that, perhaps there is an avenue to really speak about the secondary benefits of it benefiting society as a whole. It's economic opportunity, it's education opportunity, it's redistributing families' income so they can put food on their table. It's all of these things that I think can have a huge benefit on the overall happiness and benefit in the society and economic benefit of society. That perhaps isn't well mentioned when you're just kind of describing the nuts and bolts of a TDM plan or program.
I think to piggyback on what Dana said, I noticed that when in working in TDM, there's a heavy focus on the commute hours, like 6 to 9 and then 5 to 7 or 4 to 7, whenever. But there's not a big focus on all the small trips that people take throughout the day, like going from meeting to meeting, or when they're going to their place of worship, or when they're going to, or if they work a different time than 9 to 5, that there's not a lot of focus on those things. And to her point, I think it's important to bring in some of those small businesses. Like if I live in a neighborhood where I could technically bike to the grocery store because it's a mile from my house, but I get in my car, what's the benefit for me to say I could bike there, or I could walk to that place? We don't really say that there's a benefit to that, because we're only focused on those hours before and after work. And so I think thinking about it in that way, like how can we help those businesses and the small businesses, the grocery stores, the places of worship, because we're traveling there too. And those are usually somewhere about 5 miles around where we live or work. And we could usually get there without having to drive a car.
All right. So I think we have time for one last question, which is maybe perhaps a little bit more specific, but I think it's something that's been touched on also multiple times here. And that's that TDM is often thought of as very focused on white collar workers and on the 9-to-5 commute schedule. So how does the field do a better job reaching contract workers, support workers, the people who are often not thought about as much by management, the people who are harder to reach, may have language barriers, and in researching some equity and TDM material to put this together, I found that there's been a considerable amount of research that's found that most TDM programs really struggle to get, say, transit passes into the hands of those workers. It's easy enough to get them to a white collar population, but the folks at the bottom of the work food chain, so to speak, are having a much harder time. So both from a philosophical perspective of emphasizing that that's how programs should be set up, and from a more practical perspective of trying to convince your own planning world and the management of private companies that this is how it should work. How would you go about that?
I think we're struggling with that now. And we're struggling to figure out, for example, for the Main Streets pilot, in which we put trolley cards in the hands of workers directly. One thing we didn't take into account is that sometimes people don't have an address, employees, right? Or the address that they have is not stable. It changes. So thinking about that, struggling to think about if we were to extend the program, what would that look like? There's the easy thing would be to find a way to institutionalize the program in a way that can just make it easy for people to either pick up, for example, pick up Charlie cards or have it mailed to them. But again, the issue of mailing is really has really been a problem. Of the 1,000 cards that we sent out, we had like a 3% return rate, which isn't a lot, but that's like, it's actually more like 3 to 4% return rate. So we had like 40 letters come back with $60 subsidies on them. So my response is, I'm not sure, but we're struggling with it.
I think it's very difficult to sometimes get knowledge out to employees or residents that they can participate in programs. Sometimes there is a language barrier. Sometimes there is just a mailing address challenges. There are a whole plethora of ways where it can be difficult. And perhaps that means that we shouldn't just have one way where trying to communicate with a community or group of people that are able to participate in a program. Sometimes I think it maybe takes multiple avenues, and seeing programs out there that have been successful. Sometimes it takes champions on the ground. I know there's a county in a program here in Alameda County that works directly with schools. And so there's a champion in a school who's really advocating for students to get free transit passes. And that program model works in this context, but maybe not appropriate elsewhere. So I hope maybe it needs to be dynamic in some way, where we're not just trying to access participants through one channel, but very difficult, yes.
Any final thoughts?
I have a question for Dana, because I was thinking that too, if there was some way. I realize that in many of our positions, we aren't the person, or maybe there's not the resources to be the HR, for lack of a better word, for the smaller company. But is there a way to compensate the champion in that job to get people signed up? And maybe that's what needs to happen in a situation like that. Like, we don't have to do it, but I can train you and you get these people signed up, and maybe you get a commission off of it. Maybe we just pay you directly. But that seems like maybe the way to do it, as opposed to it just not happening at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about the property managers at residential developments or property managers at employment centers or businesses, and they just don't have the capacity. But a resident or an employee would might have the time, and they should be compensated for it. Also, or a local community member, maybe someone from a business district, or a whole variety, I think, of options. Something else came to mind too on that line, Renee, and I forgot. Oh yes, thank you. Also, transportation demand management practitioners, like run TDM programs at sites. I think of those that run those programs, and they're so impressive in the scale and the types of programs that they run. And I think their jobs could be expanded and their titles could grow. And that could be also another opportunity to really elevate kind of a TDM coordinator's work and what that person does on the ground. TDM coordinator. I was really losing my words there.
All right, well, thank you all. This has been, as I think, I hope you're seeing in the chat, a really wonderful session, and folks are really appreciating it. It's really given us a lot to chew on, which was, I think, the vision that we had for it. So thank you again all for coming out, participants and speakers alike. And I'm just going to speak a little bit about where we go from here. I think from my perspective personally, I would love to see this conversation continue going. We are going to post the recording of the session to the MPO's YouTube channel. We are going to then send the link to that recording to everyone who registered. I know we had people who registered knowing they weren't going to be able to make it in hopes of getting the link to the recording. We will also send out some additional materials that we had put together in support of this, a list of sources on equity and TDM, that kind of a proprietary reward for all of you coming. And we also have some other things that we'll send along. In addition to that, so the work that I did to put together this event was funded by a line item in the budget of the MPO staff, approved by the MPO board way back like 18 months ago. We have another small amount of money to do similar work next year. I don't know what that's going to look like yet. There may be some public facing events, but really what we're going to be focusing on is defining what role a regional agency can play in establishing kind of a regional TDM practice, supporting the people who are doing the work on the ground, especially in a very equitable way. So if you have thoughts on that, especially those of you who are based in the Boston region, I really look forward to continuing the conversation and continuing to learn from you all. So I am going to turn off the recording at this point and thank everybody who helped put this together, especially Stephanie and Travis and his colleague Allison Felix from MAPC, my colleague Roisin Foley, Tegan for doing the introduction, numerous others who I'm sure I forgot to mention, and of course to our panelists, Renee, Ala, Dana, and Tim. So have a great night, everyone.